magazine format that our host Richard Gisbert presents every week. We realized pretty early on in our research that in taking on the task of trying to craft a narrative about an institution with an almost 100-year history, we needed a bit of a longer format. Even then, there are still so many elements that we didn't get to touch on. That's part of what I hope we're going to be able to do a bit of this evening. For those of you who haven't yet had a chance to watch this piece, what we tried to do was to answer one big question. Can the BBC, its domestic news and current affairs arm, report impartially on the UK government, given the way in which it's funded? And we tried to answer that by looking back at three pivotal points in the BBC's history. Its first real test of editorial independence around the general strike of 1926, its coverage of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, mainly under the Prime Ministership of Margaret Thatcher, and its coverage of the Iraq War during the New Labour government of Tony Blair. The point of looking back at those three instances was to assess where the BBC finds itself today, almost a century on under the Boris Johnson government. There was so much we didn't have a chance to get to. The reporting on the Suez Crisis, the coverage of the Falklands War, Scottish independence referendum, the most recently, the coverage of the pandemic. But we thought that the flashpoints that we chose best illustrated the BBC's struggle for independence. Our plan tonight is to ask a few questions of our panel about some of the issues that the film raises, then some questions about the current predicament under Johnson, before ending with where they see the BBC heading as it moves into its second century. I'm going to start for the first half hour or so, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. So please start thinking about what you might like to ask our panelists. You can either submit written questions through the Q&A panel box. I'll give you a bit more detail when we start the questions. Or if you'd like to ask them in person, just raise your virtual hand and we'll come to you and just hope and pray that Zoom doesn't fail on us. So let me introduce our panelists, all voices from our film. We have Tom Mills, who's a lecturer in sociology at the University of Aston, and he is also the author of The BBC, Myth of a Public Service. Paul Mason is a writer and broadcaster, and before that, he was the economics editor at both Channel 4 News and, of course, BBC Newsnight. David Dimbleby is a long-time presenter of current affairs programmes and documentaries for the BBC. He's best known for presenting BBC's general election programme since 1979 and for chairing Question Time for 24 years until 2018. So as you can imagine, this is a pretty intimidating position for me to be in right now. Let's start with the general strike, and something, David, that you said to me once you'd seen the film. You thought maybe we were a little bit harsh about the BBC's role during the general strike, when the organisation had only just started and was as yet untested. You went on to say that you didn't think that it became a mouthpiece of the government. Can you explain what you meant by that? And then maybe, Tom, you want to come in after David and respond to him.
Yeah, I will, Flo, and thanks very much for having me here. I have to say, I mean, I can't speak as the BBC. I've worked with them for years, but I'm not the BBC. My voice is mine. So things I say may not be exactly what the BBC would like to have heard. But having said that, I thought it was quite weird to go back 100 years nearly to the general strike, when the BBC had only been in existence for 3 or 4 years, and to sort of lambast it for its handling of the general strike, which actually, if you think back to it, Lord Reith, or Reith at the time, Lord Reith was concerned about what to do. This was a brand new organization just on radio with people sending in voluntary subscriptions to keep it going, but obviously it was very powerful. And the first instinct of the government was to take it over. And actually Reith thought in a way, it'd be better if the government took it and we'll stand back, you know. Nobody knew what this thing was at that time in 26. And you made a lot of fuss about Reith putting a couple of lines into the speech that the Prime Minister made, but there's more. Winston Churchill was absolutely fuming mad that the BBC wasn't the servant of the government. I mean, it seems to me anyway now wholly irrelevant, because we've been through far more and we're in a completely different world. And to fuss about what the BBC did in the general strike seems to me a waste of company time.
What I'd like to do, Tom, is to give you an opportunity to respond, because I think that you know some of the details very, very clearly on what actually happened in and around the general strike. So
my point is, why does it matter? Why does it matter?
Okay, so I'll start with why it matters. And the reason it matters, in my opinion, is that it tells us something about the ambiguous position that the BBC has found itself actually since the general strike, which is that it's neither been independent of government nor a direct instrument of government. Now, what Churchill wanted to do is he wanted to make the BBC a direct instrument of government. What Baldwin and other people in the cabinet recognised was actually it was much more effective for them to leave the BBC on a longer leash, which would allow them to apply pressure to the BBC, and that would give the BBC more legitimacy. So during the general strike, the BBC remains in this sort of grey area. Now, just on the question of like the historical record as to what happened with the BBC, I mean, so usually in accounts of the BBC, say for example by Nick Robinson, there's this acknowledgement that the BBC wasn't impartial. I mean, if anything, I think the film was too soft on Reef. Reef was very enthusiastic about the Prime Minister. He gave a message when the strike had ended and said that it only remains for me to thank the Prime Minister and God for steering us through this time. And then what he does is he reads out Jerusalem live on air, and he gets, this is a true story, and it's from Reef's own account. And when he records this, he says that he asked the BBC choir in the final section of Jerusalem to start singing in the background as he reads the poem. So that was how the BBC conducted itself during the strike in terms of reporting. Now, in terms of the relationship with the state, the BBC actually moved, key BBC personnel moved from the BBC's building into the Admiralty, which is the equivalent, you know, the Pentagon at the time. It's the greatest imperial power the world's ever seen. It's the state which is the BBC is subordinated to. So historically, if anything, the BBC, it doesn't portray the BBC, it portrays the BBC as being more independent. And there's a lot of details in my book if people are interested in this. But why is it relevant? I mean, the answer to that question, as I said, is that it demonstrates the ambiguity of the BBC's position. And my argument is that actually that isn't simply an historical detail. That's something which remains in terms of the BBC's sort of quasi-independence throughout its life. Sometimes it's more free, sometimes it's less free, but it's always under, as John Burt put it, under the shadow of the state. And I think that's a really important way that we need to understand some of the limitations of the BBC.
And I think, sorry, just for any of our viewers, John Burt is a Director General that comes later. I think that for the reasons that we put it into the film was we felt it was a very clear illustration of the very first test of the BBC's editorial independence from government. And in addition to that, it was a test that came immediately before the creation of the first charter. And so it really sets up the way in which the BBC could then move forward vis-a-vis its relationship with the government.
If I may, Flo, I think it's also worth adding.
But Flo, it's like talking about, you know, talking about an adult who's now in his middle age, the BBC as it is now, and then complaining about what it did when it was a toddler. You know, it's absurd to go back that far. And Tom, I know you're a, you know, clever researcher into all this stuff and you've got to make a case. But actually, I don't think 26 is relevant. I don't see why you're wasting time on it.
Well,
I mean, it's much more important whether the BBC is today subject to pressure from government and how it resists. Those are the things that
matter. If you want to understand the BBC, if you want to understand any institution, you have to understand, first of all, its origins. Now, it may be that that's irrelevant, but actually, I don't think that it actually is irrelevant if you look at the current structure of the BBC. So what I do with my book, and I think what the film does quite well, is look at a series of historical episodes. Elements of the BBC has changed, like a lot of its organisational structure has shifted, but its fundamental relationship with the British state hasn't particularly. I mean, there have been various elements of cultural change that I think are important. Now, to say that you know, we all grow up, but our childhood, it obviously has a formative experience on us if we're going to run with your analogy of how we understand a human being and their origins. But the point is, like, structurally, the organisation is not so different, right? It still is answerable to the state. And we see this regularly in terms of its relationship with the government, in terms of its charter renewal, in terms of the establishment of its licence fee, in terms of the appointment of people to the board. So, like, what was Reef worried about? Reef was worried about not getting the BBC's Royal Charter. Well, that hasn't been put on a statutory footing where the BBC is able to maintain its independence. What actually happens is the BBC has to keep worrying about going back to the government periodically. And these aren't controversial points. I'm sure you'll agree with them. So that I think is why it's relevant. It's not about, oh, look what the BBC did in 1926. It's about, well, what is the nature of this organisation? What are its weaknesses? How can we avoid them in the future? And I think it's an illustrative episode as well as an historically important one.
Paul, was there anything that you wanted to add before I kind of move the conversation on into sort of the Thatcher years?
Yeah, yes. Well, first of all, my granddad was in the general strike. And I'm pretty confident that during the war, when it mattered, the Second World War, they believed what the BBC told them, but only provisionally and critically. He was a miner. The image that sticks in my mind is that the payload, the payoff, as it were, for what the BBC did during the general strike is a scene that George Orwell speaks about in May 1940 during the Dunkirk crisis. Orwell's in a pub, a working class pub, and he says to the bar woman, "Can we switch the radio on?" And nobody in the bar wants to switch it on. There only is BBC radio, and in fact, at one point they turn it off. This is on the day that Italy declared war on Britain. In other words, if we don't have, if people's life experience tells them that the government is in some way, the government is using the BBC as an ideological tool against them, the payoff later, when you need everybody to really, as it were, cohere around a moment of national crisis, can be that the state, this is true of all state broadcasters, that they lose authority. That's why I think it's relevant, David, because I think, unfortunately, that is kind of relevant to everything that the BBC has gone through since the Burt era. One final thing, we can be absolutely sure that nobody who worked for the BBC was in any way sympathetic or had any life experience of being a miner in 1926. But that is not true now. We have minorities working for the BBC, black people, gay people, all the people that the right in British society want to silence. And so it's a battleground in a far more tangible way than it was then.
Well, I'd agree with that last point, and I don't think we've gone far enough on that, by the way, because I think the representation of the entire nation who pays the license fee is absolutely critical to the proper execution of the BBC's duty. I mean, this idea about, what was it? Answerable to the state is a rather grandiose way of putting it, Tom. I know your views on this, but I'll tell you just briefly mine. Of course, if you have a publicly funded BBC, the level of the fee has got to be set by governments, successive governments. There's no other way of doing it. The government is responsible to the voter, and the voter is paying the license fee, and therefore it has to go through the hands of Parliament. I know you think it could be taken away from Parliament. I don't think it can. I think everybody knows this, and it's clear and out in the open. And when these battles take place, everybody knows that the government of the day has the power to bully the BBC and always has done. And I'm interested in Paul's point. I mean, I think, Paul, you'd agree that I can understand that in the very beginning of the war, by the middle of the war, and toward, I think people then did. I mean, my father was a war correspondent, right through, and in the concentration camps at the end and everything. I think by then people really did trust the BBC. They didn't, well, put it like this, they didn't treat the BBC with suspicion as if it were the government's mouthpiece, I think. I mean, obviously there were rows, there were arguments. There was a big argument about the coverage of the Western Desert. My dad got kicked out and sent back to London because Churchill objected to his broadcasting, but that was a technical thing apparently to do with the reports always arriving late, so that when he said we've had a great success, it was just after a retreat, and when we said we've had a terrible retreat, it was just after a great success, because it took 3 days for the stuff to get back to London. But that's another matter.
We're gonna take this on now into the Thatcher years and beyond. And Tom, I wanted to ask you a question, something you brought up with me in the interview. You said that the 1980s was probably the time when the BBC's journalism was at its most combative, when it came to challenging the government, and that it became more timid again in the 90s. Can you just explain a little bit what you meant about that thesis, and then Paul and David can give us their responses, their own observations from their experiences?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'd imagine, Paul and David will be able to speak to this more anecdotally. So let me just give the broad picture of what happened, which was that the Thatcher government came in and was very hostile to the BBC for various reasons, but in the period of mid to late Thatcherism particularly, there was a quite strong move against the BBC, and most of the flashpoints were around the BBC's coverage of Northern Ireland, but also of international conflicts. So particularly at this point, reporting on foreign policy was a matter of particular contention. there were these conflicts between the BBC and the government, very, very high profile, and probably more high profile than anything until possibly the Blair era and now the Johnson government, which ultimately ended in Thatcher, after Thatcher had filled the Board of Governors with more sympathetic figures, the removal of the Director General, who was then replaced by somebody else, so Michael Checklin, not a particularly important figure for our purposes, but then journalism, someone who's brought into head journalism, was mentioned earlier, John Birt. Now, John Birt pushes through a very, very radical process of cultural and organizational change at the BBC. Was very unpopular, but essentially was, okay, well, let's give you like the pro-Birt version of this would be that a certain adaptation to the political environment, let's say, which would ensure the BBC's long-term survival, would be how Gene Seaton would put it. Birt was also, by the way, allied with the New Right. He was a neoliberal in the very narrow sense of the word. He would go for lunch with Keith Joseph and have lunch at the Institute of Economic Affairs. And he brought all of that with him at the BBC. And he changed the culture slowly, but surely, during the 1990s, integrated the BBC more into the market, but made its journalism more risk averse. And that's the main aspect which I looked at in a lot of detail at the BBC, was that process of cultural change. It wasn't very well understood at the time, but essentially there were two elements of it. Number one, the BBC becoming more business-minded and more market-orientated. So something like what happened in the NHS was rolled out, a very unpopular program called Producer Choice at the BBC. That was the internal reform of program making, commissioning, and so on. And the other element of it was risk-averse journalism, which had a rationale, which was called the mission to explain. And essentially the justification was that journalism needs to be more rigorous and more analytical, where essentially became a process of risk-averse script approval for journalism, which had become more combative, and had become, investigative journalism had an impact on the BBC, often via the ITV companies and via other media organisations, via the influence of the New Left, just generally a more irreverent culture. So all of that's coming to head in the 1980s, and Birt is kind of the resolution of that political conflict that comes to a head with Thatcherism.
David, you mentioned to me when we chatted in and around the interview that Thatcher, from when you met her at the beginning, had not really done what she said she was going to do to the BBC by the time she ended her tenureship. And you had a little anecdote about a conversation that you'd had with her, and I wondered if you could share it now, because
I will.
very telling of this kind of what happened to the BBC, or didn't.
Yes, I will, certainly. But let's just deconstruct a bit of what Tim's saying. I mean, all governments will have battles with the BBC and dislike them and distrust the BBC if the BBC is doing its job. I don't think Tom would disagree with that. I mean, no, if the BBC is doing its work, it's never going to be loved by the people in power, because look at today. I mean, what they want, what of course you want if you're a prime minister or politician, you don't want to be criticized at all. You want to be praised to the heavens. You want to be told that, what you're doing is inevitable and all the rest of it. So first of all, there's always going to be battles. So simply to say there were battles between the BBC and the government is not really to tell us anything. When you come to the Thatcher and the John Birt issue, you have to remember the other person who wanted the mission to explain was a Labour supporter, Peter Jay. Birt and Jay together put together the idea and wrote articles in the Times about it, of the mission to explain. And the reason for that was that they felt that BBC journalism was getting sloppy. I don't think there was a political agenda here. He had lunch with Keith Joseph, wow. But the point is, there was a new style. I didn't like it, I have to say. I didn't like what he did. I mean, I was at this is a very typical
misreading of what was going on at the BBC. They were both shared politics. Just because he happened to be a Labour supporter, he was one of the largest, greatest advocates of monetarism in that period. Yeah, but you're making, as you'll remember, right? Yeah, Peter Jay. He was also a big fan of Milton Friedman. He popularised all those politics. I'm surprised you didn't know that.
Sorry, what are you trying to say? That Jay and Birt came in to take over the BBC with monetarist policies? Is that your line?
That's what happened, yeah.
That's not what happened.
Not monetarist policy.
Well, hang on a second. We'll bring Paul in on this because he'd know better than me. But I don't think that, I mean, I didn't like the way that Birt tried to, I mean, the first thing he tried to do was, as you say, to cost everything, the BBC, because it was not costed, and that seemed to be expensive. And the second thing, which was ridiculous, was to get reporters to write down what they were going to say before they went on a story, and then come back with it, and they'd check whether it fitted with what they said they were going to say. That was manifestly untrue, and it was resisted, and I don't think it happened. But I'd like to know what Paul thinks about it.
So I obviously wasn't there at the BBC in the 1980s. I was on miners' picket lines, and I think that I remember watching the Orgreave, the famous debacle of the doctored Orgreave report. I also remember Frank Boff, who was we know Frank Boff kind of ended up as a sort of reputational damaged person, but Frank Boff, as a current affairs presenter, did a very rigorous interview with a politician on the night of Orgreave, saying, "We don't break heads." He said, "We don't break heads in Britain." I remember it really clearly. Now, to give you an example, I mean, I only know about BBC current affairs in the 1980s by talking to people I then subsequently worked with. You could self-deploy. So if you were a senior correspondent, you could go to Heathrow, ring your manager and say, "I'm off to Thailand to see what's happening." You could, the levels of freedom. I mean, Jeremy Paxman was, before he was a presenter, was an absolutely excellent current affairs reporter. And as I remember it, I want to get the details right here. He filmed an IRA ambush with the effectively embedded with the IRA, for which he got into
had a tip off. I think that there was
yeah,
going.
That's
to
right. I mean, basically, he was there.
If you go to such and such a place with a camera, you may. I think the words were, "You'll see something interesting." Yes,
and he saw 7 blokes in balaclavas with AKs wandering through. But no, he got into trouble for that. But it was felt that you could do that. The problem is it's not John Burton and Peter Jay necessarily. I mean, although I agree, you know, they were there to do a job. By the end of it, all that had gone. That's what functionally John Burke got rid of. No, actually, I don't think it was the worst. If you think of the BBC as a pyramid of descent, it wasn't, for me, the worst moment, because what it then produced was a culture of fight back within the newsrooms. And when I got into the BBC, I was working with senior people who had been fighting back against this for quite some time. And so, you know, where does Gilligan come from? Where does, on Newsnight, when the Iraq War broke out, 2001, 2003, I remember that the programme sent its 2 teams into Iraq unembedded. This is when Terry Lloyd had actually been shot unembedded from ITN. So going in unembedded was completely unpopular. They got nowhere. They got stymied by military checkpoints, but they tried. So that culture of trying was in a way produced by Burtism. And I don't think it was the end of I don't see it as a kind of sometimes an end point of independence. Sorry, Flo, you're trying to shut me up. Thank you.
No, I'm not trying to shut you up. I just actually want to bring in something that comes up very clearly in the film, and this is a great moment to do it. We've had so much feedback about the back and forth between you and David in the film regarding the BBC's coverage of the Iraq War. Paul, you have this line in the film where you say, "We become a government mouthpiece," and that on Newsnight, certain anti-war voices weren't actually allowed. I think you mentioned Tariq Ali explicitly. Yeah. David, you say you rather doubt that happened. So we really want to get to the bottom of it. Paul, can you explain what it was like on Newsnight in the run-up to the war? And then David can have a chance to respond.
Well, look, no, the point I made specifically was that I certainly heard senior members of the team going around the office saying we're not having Tariq Ali on the programme, okay? I also say that I went into the editor, George Entwistle, because most of my life and my contacts were people who've been on those demos, 2 million strong. I wasn't allowed to go on them. And I said, when are you going to have a voice from the demos? Because what happened was that they had got anti-war voices on, but what they were, as it were, loyal Labour oppositionists. I remember Glenda Jackson, who, you know, she was, in the end, there was 2 cases against the war. There was, this is an imperialist war for oil, and there is, let's not do it because it might upset the world too much. I didn't think that the civil society opposition coming from British civil society, when we get a 2 million strong demo, I'd never seen that in my life. That was not reflected well. at all. And for example, even the points where, I don't know if you remember, the school strikes broke out against the Iraq war on the days that it happened. I mean, and those struggled to get on. So look, I don't want to make a huge thing about it, because I think, Dave, the two things can be true. That Question Time could have covered it, but it's about what voices you privilege at the time. And I think that, by the way, let's say as well, it can also be true that excellent journalism was done to interrogate the government's reasons for going to war. But my feeling was that the permission to do that was being, let's have a kind of gentleman's disagreement inside the British elite about whether the war's a good idea, was being framed, that was being allowed. Permission for that discussion was bought by not reflecting the widespread opposition to the war on fundamental grounds of anti-imperialism that existed in society.
Well, anti-imperialism and a number of other things. But I couldn't speak for Newsnight. All I was saying was that on Question Time, which I was doing at the time, we certainly had endless, vigorous debate, and we had Tariq Ali on the panel. And nobody put any pressure on us not to have Tariq Ali on the panel that I can remember. I think, I mean, obviously, you would know better than me, but I mean, editorial decisions by News are immensely tricky to take, and I don't know what the circumstances with Newsnight was. I can understand people saying, "Oh, not Tariq Ali again," if they thought he'd been on too much, but that's a different point. But you asked me, Flo, just about the Thatcher thing. I just bring that up because it was quite interesting, and I think it's relevant. Mrs. Thatcher always said she wanted to cut the BBC down to size, and she was always critical of it and thought it was overstuffed with people, and it was, too liberal and didn't understand Hayek and Milton Friedman, though actually we made the first film about that for Panorama, I did, but anyway. And she was always going on about it. And sometime later, I sat next to her at a charity lunch, and I said, "Why didn't you dismantle the BBC? What's been going on? What's happened?" And she said, in that I won't do the voice because the imitation is too facile, but she turned to me and she said, "Well, Mr. Dimbleby, the truth is, every time I try to do anything about the BBC, people come out of the woodwork to defend it." And I knew exactly what she meant. And actually it was people close to her advisors who, and I hope maybe the same thing has happened with Boris Johnson, who say, it's no good trying to take on the BBC. It won't work. People actually like and respect the BBC. That's why it has ratings of 60% in favor in the country as a whole against, I think the next one is sort of other television stations on about 7 or 10% and newspapers on 2% for where do you trust the stuff you get. And, the worry, of course, Paul, is that if it's trusting stuff it shouldn't be trusting, then that's a bad deal. But I just, I think it's difficult to rubbish, particularly during this COVID time, the way the British public does actually support what the BBC does, whatever Tom may think about it.
I agree. The reason the government hasn't been able to dismantle the BBC is because it has popular support. It's the same reason for the NHS, and it has popular support for good reason, that we should have an independent public broadcaster that's able to hold the government to account. Now, what's the dispute is whether the BBC is that broadcaster or whether it is always able to perform that role. And I think the scholarly record on that is very clear. If I may just very quickly go back to this question on Iraq, just to support Paul's point, I mean, Kevin Marsh, who was editor of the Today programme at that time, was very explicit in saying we're not interested in covering demonstrations. We're interested in covering an elite conversation. I mean, I quote him at some length in the book on that point. On how the BBC reported it, now the BBC makes a lot of programmes and the news tends to be the most, let's say, small c conservative. But we know from a Cardiff study that the BBC had more pro-war figures on than its competitors like Channel 4 and CNN, as well. So we know that the BBC its news output was broadly supportive of the government's case for war, and the government did put the BBC under a lot of pressure. So I think it's important to remember that, but also, it does substantiate Paul's point, which is that's explicitly how a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people in BBC journalism see as their job is to report what's going on in the corridors of power. That's how a lot of people there think of political journalism, and that's not like. That's explicitly how it is explained by Kevin Marsh. And that's what the Today programme does. That's what the big flagship operations do. And that doesn't mean that Tariq Ali can't appear on certain programmes, but that's the overwhelming pattern of coverage.
David brought into the conversation the Johnson government and where we are now, and I think this is a good opportunity for us to have a little look about the position that the BBC finds itself in today. Since we've made the film, Johnson's top advisor, Dominic Cummings, the man known to have been the driving force behind Johnson's hostility toward the BBC, has left government. I wonder, Tom, Paul, David, talk us through where you see the threat to the BBC right now. Paul, do you want to go for it?
You're muted, Paul.
He's muted.
Paul, you're muted.
I know. I just couldn't find my cursor. So I think the generic case that Tom makes in his book about the BBC, it's kind of, if you wanted a public broadcaster, you wouldn't start from where we are, because of the diversity and fragmentation of the audience and the implicit contradictions into the relationship with the government. However, I think we're facing something that we probably haven't seen in the history of the BBC, and that is the following: the model that authoritarian conservatism wants to follow is the Fox News, Breitbart model of journalism. Now, the existence of the BBC makes it impossible for that to happen. So to be clear, Fox News is seen and recorded in many academic studies as an amplifier of disinformation. That is its function in the American ecosystem. It's not just a dodgy, a bad news program. It amplifies disinformation. So the BBC is brilliant, even now, at not amplifying disinformation. And so this is in terms of news. When it comes to culture, the BBC is even now promoting, for example, diversity. Look at Strictly, this iteration of Strictly. To the authoritarian right, the way Strictly looks now, and the way that the news works now, is anathema. And their agenda is to destroy the BBC for that reason. So for all my criticisms of it, I have to defend what it is, even though I don't like it. I think that's possibly the difference between me and Tom. I would love to try and start again. I think if we've got a different government, the only reform I think that you could usefully and quickly do was something we talked about in the 10, 15 years ago, top slicing the license fee, to take about a fifth of the license fee and give it to more diverse and better public service broadcasters. Number one of which I would say would be Channel 4. And even Channel 5, actually, I think has developed news values and communicative ability that the BBC sometimes doesn't have. But given the choice, I will defend it just to the hilt, because the scale of what is coming from the United States via things like GB News and Talk Radio is something you've never seen in the history of public service broadcasting in the UK.
Tom, you published your own proposals for reimagining the BBC, which we feature very briefly at the end of the film. Can you break down your main ideas on what you'd like to see change at the BBC and why?
Yeah, some very straightforward things. So we can look at the history of problems at the BBC, which is mainly to do with the government's ability to influence, how the BBC reports, or at least shape the broader sort of political culture there. Just very quickly, on this point of disinformation, I agree with a lot of what Paul said, but I think it's important for us to remember disinformation often comes from governments, and that's one of the important reasons actually why we need to remove any government influence over the BBC. So the three main things would be the obvious ones: reduce the government's power to appoint people to the board, get rid of the government's power to set the rate of license fee, and put the BBC on statutory footing so it doesn't have to keep going back to the government to ask for a new royal charter. So then you need arm's length body, which would, something like Ofcom, which would be able to set the rate of the license fee. You move away from license fee, in my opinion, towards the kind of shift that's taken place in some Scandinavian countries. It could come through some form of general taxation or some other form of levy. But basically the problem with the license fee is it's connected to television. and you want to secure the future of public media, you need to move away from television and you need to move into digital. Now, the next question becomes, okay, well, if we get rid of governmental control, what are the mechanisms of accountability that David mentioned earlier? Well, they could be to Parliament, David, you're right, because they're not currently to Parliament, they're currently to the government. So they're basically effectively to whoever's running number 10 and their close advisors. It would be nice to have it accountable to Parliament. That would be more democratic. I would prefer that there was a form of accountability which was outside the formal political system. So you could have experiments in local democratization. And I've also made proposals, you know, perhaps more radical versions of what Paul's laid out to do with the commissioning process. Now, at the moment, a lot of money goes from the BBC into the private sector, and these big corporate indies that make a lot of the programs that you see on the BBC. I think that can be redirected towards more democratic forms of programming and production, but also independent. So like not these big companies that are producing programs. And so what you're looking for eventually is moving towards a devolved media system where power becomes broken up, where you don't have this sort of politicized managerial bureaucracy that controls program making. So you want to maximize the creativity and the independence of journalists and program makers. And you want to do that. I think you want to keep the BBC's strengths, and that's the economy of scale to some degree, but you want to try and find ways of reducing the politicization of the bureaucracy that comes with that. So that's the challenge, I think. But the future, I think, is indeed devolving power at the BBC, making it more localized, tearing it away from London, removing it from the state, putting it more firmly in around the civil society, and moving it away from television and more towards digital. So that's the future I think we should be discussing in like broad outlines.
David, you felt that we could have really pushed Tom a little harder on these proposals. So now, chance, please fire away.
No, I mean, of course he should be pushed hard on them because they're, you know, it's a whole raft of things that he would like to see. And I can understand why, you know, if you start from scratch, you would want it done differently. You wouldn't want huge indies doing things. He's quite right. You wouldn't want this, you wouldn't want that. But I want to come to what I think is the nub of the issue. And I think it's the most difficult issue. And I think it's the battle that the BBC has always had, and we've been touching on, which is the relationship between the BBC and government. Under a parliamentary system, the government, you say it's not Parliament that decides, the government decides, if it has a majority in Parliament, decides these key things about taxation and license fees. And I don't see how you can get away from that. In the end, somebody has got to say, what is it now, £157? I have a view about how that should be raised, which is a different matter. I think it should be raised as in Germany, a system invented actually by a future Director General of the BBC, Hugh Carlton-Green, was invented after the war for Germany when they set up a system I like very much, which is a federal, 22, I think there are, public service broadcasting organizations. And the money is raised from a household tax. So that in Britain, for instance, instead of everybody having to pay £157, whether they're rich or poor, people in a large house will pay more, people in a poorer house, in a flat, people on universal benefit perhaps would pay less or nothing. But that's one important thing. You cannot get away, I think, from having a parliamentary and therefore government majority control over a decision that affects people's purse. We don't do it with the NHS. We don't do it with the money that goes on to education. You cannot say £157, please. Oh, and actually nobody's responsible for this. So that I, as a voter, can't say, I want a government that will reduce it to 150. You've got to have parliamentary control. And of course, Tom, you then get into the difficulty that we've all been talking about of the relationship between the body that receives that money and the body that authorizes it, not gives it. It's given by the license payer. And the BBC has this funny kind of triangular relationship. It's real relationship. And I think this is the most important thing, is with the license payer. It's with the people who fund the work we do, the films that are made, the broadcasting that's done. That's where its strength lies. That's why I told the story about Margaret Thatcher. Because if you try as Prime Minister to destroy the BBC, as indeed Boris Johnson clearly would like to diminish its role, anyway, I'm not sure where they stand now that Cummings is gone. If you do that, what you have to do is make sure that the Prime Minister is taking on the electorate. In other words, you shift the battle from between the BBC and the Prime Minister. You say, all right, you say we should do that. Go and ask your voters whether they want that. And I think the answer will be the 60% I said that support the BBC. I think the answer will be, as long as the BBC is doing its job reasonably well. And I'm absolutely with you about failures the BBC's made. And I would like to see much greater diversity, both on screen and actually within the structure of the BBC. But despite all that, the BBC, its strength in the end is to the listener and the viewer. That's where it gets its authority from, in my opinion, not from government. And you have to find a way always of positioning the BBC with the listener and the voter.
So before we go to our listeners and our voters, Tom, Paul, if you just want a chance to respond to David, please do so. And people, get your questions ready. I will be coming to you in a second.
Look, I agree with David that the strength of the BBC is the support of the public, and I think that the question becomes, how do you strengthen that relationship? And it's like you create more buy-in. Okay, now currently speaking, the BBC will start to feel quite removed to a lot of people and quite a lot of important demographics. If the BBC doesn't respond to that, it's going to lose that public support, and then public media is going to become very vulnerable. Now, in terms of the specific question of like accountability to government, there's a whole raft of institutions which are state institutions which don't have that level of political control. I mean, things like the Bank of England have existed for a long time, and they've moved from to more to less political control. So there are a lot of state institutions. The Metropolitan Police would be another, which is technically supposed to have independence from government, which is accountable to Home Secretary. What I'm saying is you make that, you push the BBC further away from the government. Now, of course, the people can elect a government and get rid of the BBC if that's what they want to do. But the question is, what do you want to have a relationship there where the government is always able to strong arm the BBC? Or do you not? And I think the way you do that is you have an arm's length body which is able to set the rate of the licence fee on broad terms. And of course, anything in a parliamentary democracy is renegotiable through Parliament. But I don't think it's very healthy for the major broadcaster in a state to have to periodically negotiate with the government on the day. I don't think you think that, really.
Well, what do you think? I'm not taking over as chair.
I would only say, no, I would only, thank you for that, David. I would only say, my difference here is I'm just living in the world of realpolitik. If I was Tim Davie now, I had dealings with Tim during the time when he was interim DG after the Savile McAlpine disaster, and I think he's a very realistic person. Despite the fact that he has a Tory background, I think at that time he was dealing with a liberal conservative government. Now we're dealing with an authoritarian right-wing conservative government, and its programme of the BBC is probably much more radical than anything that's been briefed out. If you think about it long term, why would my ex-colleague Andrew Neil and the whole Spectator people be piling in with money, Robbie Gibb, with money, all ex-Newsnight people, by the way, all piling in with money to set up a politicised rival to the BBC if they didn't think there would be regulatory approval for it. There's going to be regulatory approval for basically Fox News UK, something similar. And so to me, setting the BBC as a public broadcaster that can survive that and outcompete it is going to be important. But it's going to be, what I'm trying to say is, people like us, we've all had our run-ins with BBC management, and I've had my long-term critique of it. I think that's not the game anymore. The game is for sections of the right to destroy public service broadcasting. And so all we've got is public service broadcasting. I actually think the first line of it will be Ofcom, the politicised appointments to Ofcom, the reduction of its remit, the blind eye turn to the emergence of a new Fox News type approach. That's the game we're in for the next 2 or 3 years.
Okay, so sorry, I'm going to, sorry, David, I'm going to interject just because I think it's important for people to be able to ask some questions. So the time has come for audience to please raise your virtual hand by clicking on the participants button at the bottom of your screen. Then in the dialog box that'll come up, you'll see a little button with 3 dots in the bottom right-hand corner. Click on that and you'll get an option to raise your hand. We can then come to you, or you can just type up your question by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. and we'll just read it out. Just please remember to tell us who you'd like to answer it and be as concise as possible. I'm going to start here with a question from Ivor Gabor, and I will give it to you, David. How about an element of public election for some of the BBC's governing body, as opposed to the present situation, which gives 100% of the right to appoint to the government?
But for a public election, I wouldn't be against that at all. I'm not sure how many people will bother to vote, and I'd be interested to know who bothers to vote. It might be that the people Paul Mason are talking about, the ones who want to, if he's right, turn the BBC to the right or celebrate, they'd be the ones who voted. I don't know, but I don't think that would help. I'm not sure how much power what are they now? Are they governors or trustees at the moment? I can't remember, but they keep on changing.
Members now,
what?
Yeah, directors.
What?
They're just called directors now.
Directors.
They're just called directors.
Yeah. I don't think that. I think the chairmanship actually is an important one. The appointment of chairman at the BBC, because as you rightly said at the beginning, it was Duke Hussey who sacked Alistair Milne as the first, and indeed the only really hostile act he did as chairman. He then became rather an agreeable chairman, which in BBC terms means somebody who doesn't mess you about.
We have a question, please, from Michael Doyle. Michael, please just wait for you to be unmuted and then throw your question to any of our panelists.
Can you hear me?
We can indeed, yes.
I hear you perfectly.
Excellent. Thank you very much. This has been an excellent discussion and very informative. I just wanted to pick up on this issue about trust in the BBC. So recent polls from Reuters have shown that trust among left-wingers in the BBC has plummeted over the past few years. Is this down to a series of editorial accidents during the last general election, which seemed only to benefit the government, or is it because of more long-standing structural problems within the BBC? And that question is open to all three of the panelists. Thank you.
Paul, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, my critique of the BBC is that a lot of what is wrong with it is about the recruitment of a set of people from institutions that teach that basically the world is all right, and who, once you've gone through the process of getting into the BBC, that there is a kind of, I'm talking about news here, but also the current affairs and the wider programming, that what it really needs is people who don't think the world is all right as it is. Now, I think that I made some real-time critiques of some of the BBC's election coverage, but I think basically they were the kind of mistakes that happen if you're recruiting people who think the world is fine as it is. The problem we've got in politics is that, never mind Keir Starmer and the rest of it, the population is very divided. There is a culture war going on. You can walk into a pub and hear people say masks are Marxist, woke is what's wrong with things. Why can't listen to this, why can't some of the people in Small Axe by Steve McQueen, why can't some white people play black people? That's what people are saying, right? So that's the level of right-wing plebeian, reaction racism that is there. And a lot of us are quite radical in the other direction. I don't envy the BBC for having to sit in the middle, but the problem is that kind of classic home counties, sort of military industrial complex, Reading and sort of Slough type Mondeo man and woman isn't really what you're serving anymore. You're serving a very divided population. And then you throw in devolution, you throw in Scotland, you throw in racism, you throw in transgender, and it's a no-win situation for a public broadcaster that sits there trying to ignore it all, basically saying kind of the world's kind of all right as it is, isn't it, guys? Because so many people on both sides of politics just don't agree with that.
I don't agree with that, Paul. I don't think the people who work in the BBC that I know think everything is all right with the world at all. I mean, on the point that the questioner made about Corbyn's defeat and all that, I think there is. I mean, just objectively, whoever is defeated in a general election, one of the places to lay the blame is against the BBC. Nobody ever says, BBC gave me a fair run, but we didn't win the voter over. Nobody's ever said that in the history of the world, and never will do. So, but the idea, I'm rather curious about this Mondeo. I thought we'd lost Mondeo Man years ago, Mondeo and Slough and all that. But I know what you're getting at, Paul, about but you think there's a kind of complacency at the heart of the BBC about the way the world is. I don't agree with that at all. I think that's absolutely not true. I think there's a constant searching for, different solutions and presenting problems. You listen to both radio and television, it's always problems, problems, problems. I don't get that. I don't get that feeling that you have that somehow there's a sort of, I won't call it centrist, because actually what we're talking about is conservative view. That everything, I mean, what is a proper conservative, proper Tory? Somebody who believes that you should only change things when they have to be changed. That's broadly it, isn't it? You keep the world as it is. And I've never felt that was the BBC's view. I've never felt that.
It is remarkable how many people do cross from senior positions in news to conservative governmental mouthpiece jobs. And that is quite a...
Yes!
That is...
Or go out and do speeches for tobacco companies, or go out and earn £1,000, £2,000, £20,000 doing this and that. I quite agree with all that. I mean, I belong to a kind of, rather like you would, I belong to a kind of BBC priesthood. I feel they should be, pure as the driven snow about everything. But maybe that's
I left public service broadcasting because because I agree with that. I wanted to have my say, so I left Channel 4 News. The day I announced it, George Osborne stood up in Parliament and said, the revolutionary Marxist Paul Mason is going to appear on a platform with John McDonnell. And I was supposed to serve 3 months' notice. I walked into the editor's office. I said, well, that's it, isn't it? That's the end of play. And it was. But I think, I agree with you. We should aspire to that. But what I'm saying, David, excuse me, Tom, for a second. What I'm saying is that it's not that, it's the model of we're serving the centre is very difficult because the extremes are very, very loud and strong now. So that's the basic point.
I quite agree with you, but I don't think the idea, sorry, Tom, again, but I don't think there is a concept of serving the centre. And I agree with you, I don't think there is a centre. The centre cannot hold. I mean, I think we're in a society which is so diffused now in everything, politically and socially, and in its views on race and its views on gender, all those things, that I don't think the BBC is trying to hold anything together. I don't think there is a centre.
Let's, I just want to move on for a question here from Steve Westlake, and it's something that I wanted to actually address. He says there weren't many female BBC big hitters in the film. Is that part of the problem? An old posh white boys club. And I think it's something important that we should just talk about now, because on the listening post, diversity is something that comes up at the start of every story that we do. And we didn't treat this piece any differently. Unfortunately, when it comes to academic sort of expert voices or those with personal insider experiences on these 3 specific flashpoints that we cover in the film, the pool is unfortunately very white and very male. Despite that, there were, of course, plenty of women and people of colour that we did make requests to, but none of them wanted to take part. And I just wanted to put that out there so everyone is aware of how much effort was made to make sure we had more of a diverse lineup. But that gives us an opportunity to really talk about whether or not part of the problem is at the BBC that there is a lack of diversity. Tom, I don't know if you want to pick up on that.
Okay, so just on this question of the people who work at the BBC. So obviously the BBC is a huge organisation, but you can look at the people who are the big decision makers and the most influential figures, and the Social Mobility Commission has done that, and the Russell Trust has done that, and the makeup of the BBC is broadly similar to what you would expect to find in places like the civil service, in Parliament, in the newspapers. So the picture is an overwhelming orientation towards, number 1, Oxbridge, Cambridge private school, number 2, Russell groups and grammar school, and it tends to be people, broadly from the southeast. So we know, I mean, these are the sort of facts of the people who are decision makers at the BBC. Obviously, that has an impact on the output and the sort of common sense of and culture of the organisation. And that's something that the BBC itself has acknowledged, and that they're trying to take steps to address that. I mean, I think too slowly, and I think it's important, of course, that the BBC needs to represent the diversity of the country. Would it be okay if I just quickly went back to this question of the BBC's centrist orientation? I have a paper that's going to be published soon in the next few weeks, looking at the orientation of BBC journalists on Twitter, and the overwhelming orientation was towards centrist journalists, centrist MPs, number one, then Conservative MPs, then Labour MPs, and within Labour MPs, the right wing of Labour first, and then incrementally towards the left. So to sort of shed some empirical light on the broad political culture of the BBC, that's the political core of the orientation of the BBC's journalism. The social and cultural picture is what I just described in terms of like the Social Mobility Commission's description of top decision makers of the BBC. So yeah, it's a problem. It's a problem that the BBC has acknowledged, and I think it's one that obviously needs addressing. But as Paul's pointed out, that obviously this is taking place in the context of a huge kind of contestation as to what kind of country Britain is and should be, and the BBC is having to navigate that.
We've got time for one more question from someone from the floor. John Bailey, do you want to ask a question, please?
Primarily, my question is to all the panel, and I wonder whether you could comment on Robert Peston's view that the BBC is obsessed with newspapers. If that's true, surely that influences the BBC's coverage towards a conservative viewpoint. As somebody who's been around for a long, long time, seems to me to become more prominent these days. I'm more aware of the BBC mouthing the views of this particular government, especially since Johnson took over and has rather made a mess of things. So I wonder whether you would agree that Peston and the newspapers working together. I worked in Fleet Street for 20 years, and I saw the influence, the malign influence, frankly, of most of the newspapers, and I worked for virtually all of them during that period, which was pro-conservative, apart from the Morning Star, of course. And so it's very difficult to see any change in the nature and the way in which news is reflected. If I watch BBC, if I watch Newsnight, or if I watch any of the news programmes, I know what to expect. And very often, my views are very similar to Robert Peston's.
David, would you like to take that on?
Not really, because I don't know the score there. I mean, I worked, daily programmes I worked on way back was 24 hours. And certainly the first thing everybody did when they came in the morning was read all the newspapers. And of course, the newspapers were the Telegraph, the Mail, the Times, the Mirror, the Sun in those days, the Morning Star, and the Racing Post. And I like to think the Racing Post actually gave us most of our stories, but I don't think it actually did. But John, I don't know quite. I mean, information now comes so much faster from the internet and Twitter and all that. And I think a lot of stuff comes from that. I don't think people any longer sit down and look at what the Daily Mail's saying or the Times saying. It would be too slow, wouldn't it? I mean, the process, the flow of information. In your day in Fleet Street, you know, of course, the newspapers and the BBC perhaps were slower than the newspapers and were relying on things like Reuters and Associated Press. But now stories are out there instantly on social media. And I think that's where they get there. Don't you think, John? I mean, isn't that where the impetus comes from? No,
Can I throw in something? There's a reason why daily news journalists in TV are deferential to newspaper journalists and newspapers. And I think that is because TV, as everybody knows, is a sluggish medium. To get 1 3-minute story takes you all day. Yeah, I mean, you have to cart things around. If you're a news reporter on a broadsheet, you can just literally zip into the story and get it. So there's always been that, newspapers first, TV second. The problem is, again, what we've seen is, I think, obviously, it's not just that most of the British newspapers are right-wing and have a right-wing agenda. Problem is that left-wing newspapers have a right-wing agenda as well. I mean, I work for The Guardian, and I'd be highly critical of it. There's nothing to the left of The Guardian. The Mirror isn't. Guardian wouldn't even, I'd have a big, long editorial conference about whether to vote Labour in the last election. So if you then add in, which is what they did, BuzzFeed and HuffPo, well, BuzzFeed and HuffPo are just the same Oxbridge guys, but a generation younger. And if you then added Guido Fawkes, you're in real trouble. The left doesn't have HuffPo, Guido. We don't have any news source. So I think what I would want to see people do in relation to that was not stop following really good newspaper journalism, because some of it is really good, but you've got to realize where it's going. If you look, for example, at the Express at the moment, now owned by Reach PLC, which owns the Mirror, the Express has clearly taken a business decision to mirror the agenda of Fox News. So they do things about Antifa or woke, or they put out a thing today which is basically falsified the stats on the deaths on COVID, taken from a right-wing kind of trolling website. So if you think that's a newspaper, you have to think very carefully about showcasing at the front of your public service broadcasting bulletin.
But Paul, could I just ask you a question about that? Because I'm interested in the idea that everything comes from the right. When Corbyn was having his set to with the NEC, is indeed still having it over anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, do you think that was fairly covered by the BBC and other broadcast medias, or was it taking its agenda from somewhere else? Look,
in general, I think the BBC applied its fairness and impartiality standards to it. I also think that he was in trouble because for real reasons. That is, it's not cooked up by the papers. I don't subscribe to that theory. I think the only thing is, and I think in that sense that's a bad example, because in a way I'd say the BBC, I could even say it was being Corbyn's friend. He could have used it more to ride that. It's more to me on the wider cultural issues of when you've got an American president saying there's a terrorist group called Antifa, which is to be an anti-fascist. Your dad, as you said, walked into Bergen-Belsen. To be anti-fascist is now a stigmatized thing. If you've got a British newspaper that follows that agenda, you have to think very carefully about showcasing its narratives. That's the point I'm trying to make, rather than, no, I don't think in general the BBC's been terrible about Corbyn at all. That's not my biggest beef with it.
Okay, let me just jump in on this question of anti-Semitism. I'm not going to proclaim anything on the recent coverage, but we do have one report on this that was produced by my colleague Justin Shawsberg at the Media Reform Coalition, and it found that the BBC's reporting on anti-Semitism was very, very poor, to the point that it was actually making basic factual inaccuracies at the same level as the Sun. Now, Justin Shawsberg has also done work on the representation of the press on the BBC. This is something that he's written about, so I'd recommend people read that. But I would also want to raise, this is a real problem. So I think it was John, wasn't it, who mentioned this question of the influence of the press. There was a study that Cardiff did looking in 2015 at the election, and what they did was they asked people, they looked at polling data to see what policies were most important to people during the 2015 election campaign, and what was seen as the most important in the press coverage. And what happened was, it's not like the BBC was simply echoing what the press said in the same tone, but the actual agenda, the political agenda, was being driven by the newspapers and of course by the campaigners as well. But what happened was that the newspapers were pushing the issues that the Conservatives were strong on, and the BBC was reflecting that in its output. So that's a very subtle bias, if you want to call it bias. I don't particularly like the word, but we know from this kinds of research that yes, the press has an agenda setting role on the BBC. The BBC will generally use its professional standards differently to say the Express or the Sun, but not in the case of anti-Semitism reporting. So yes, it's a problem. It's a long-standing problem that the BBC has always seen the press as being a basically legitimate centre of opinion rather than centre of power, but it's become more problematic as professional standards in the press have declined. So as newspapers like, the Telegraph used to be a serious newspaper, the Times used to be a serious newspaper. Now, the fact that these have an agenda setting role in the BBC is very serious for I think the BBC's professional values in a way that it probably wasn't in even the 1980s.
Tom, I just want to throw one thing in here. Mark Thompson, who was Director General of the BBC, I don't know, you'll know how far back, 15 years back or something, and said that when he joined the BBC, it struggled with impartiality against the massive bias to the left among its employees. Is that a BBC you recognise? Massive bias to the left.
Oh, sorry, was that to me?
Yeah, I just wondered.
Oh no,
you're going on about BBC, you know, leaning to the right.
Well, I think it's like Paul said. So So, well, it's not really for me to say what I recognise at the BBC. You both worked there. I just look at the
you studied it as an academic. You studied as an academic. What's there?
Yeah, right. Okay. So what the research tells us, what the research tells us is that the BBC, like you said, basically has a centrist orientation, but tends to lean slightly towards the right. So the most recent work has come out of Cardiff, and actually the book we mentioned earlier, the Battle for the BBC, or whatever it's called, it summarises that academic evidence, and what it notes is that yes, the BBC kind of, if you look at its news reporting, it's sort of centrist but leaning towards the right. Now, this comes back to Paul's point about the balance of the press. Basically, and I'm going to be very crude about this, the people who work at the BBC see the political spectrum as lying somewhere between the Guardian on the left and the Telegraph on the right, or possibly the Sun and the Express as well. There's popular conservatism, which is the common sense in the country, and there's nice sort of elite London-centric liberalism, and that's kind of the political spectrum. And there's a whole swathe of people, particularly young people in this country, who don't feel that that represents them or their interests. And that also overlaps with another crisis for the BBC, which is to do with the consumption patterns of audiences. And that's the crisis which I think the BBC should be thinking about. It's not just political, it's also technological. But yeah, to come back to your point about the BBC being a left-wing institution, a lot of people see this, but the evidence isn't there the actual scholarly evidence isn't there.
So, I'm going to, we've gone on a little bit longer. We've got a little extension of time. I want to throw the questions open to the floor once more, because we have another hand up from actually one of my colleagues, Tarek Naffa. Tarek, ask away. Tarek, can you hear us?
Can you?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hi. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to hear from all of you. This question is to David and Paul. Job applicants to the BBC were subject to political vetting by MI5 up until the 1990s. What experience did you have of that affecting the profile of new hires? And does the legacy of the security services vetting continue to limit the kinds of people who are hired in senior positions today?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know whether Paul knows the answer. I do know that vetting, I'll tell you one story about vetting, not to do with local news, not to do with the BBC, but local newspapers. My family used to own local newspapers, and in the late 50s, we employed somebody, and MI5 came around and said, you are away as a member. I can't remember what he was a member of exactly, but it was a sort of Trotskyist organization. We thought you should know, keep an eye on him and let us know, what he does. And we told them to bugger off, which seemed the right approach. And he stayed for us for many years.
There clearly was a documented vetting process at the BBC that was during the Cold War, and then a hangover from the Cold War, as I understand it, into the, at least into the Thatcher era. I mean, when I joined, it had clearly stopped because I'd been a left-winger, openly for a long time before I became I was recruited as a senior private sector journalist from an industry sector. I don't think they even bothered asking, could somebody who's been a deputy editor of a business magazine be a lefty? But I clearly had been. In fact, when I rang my boss and the boss secretary, I said, how do I fill this form in? What am I supposed to say when it says, what have you been doing politically? They said, well, have you been a Conservative MP, for example? I mean, literally, that's what they said. No. I'm not sure it is. There's a huge hangover. I think there's a real-time thing, which Tom mentioned, about the preference for Oxbridge-type recruiting. I don't know whether it still exists, but under Mark Thompson, for example, he tried to bring in psychometric testing, and the idea that for some people think psychometric testing he levels the playing field, but whatever it happens, you just get a lot of Oxbridge people at the BBC. That's just as simple as that. And I think that, in fact, what I would say looking forward, I think it'll be very interesting, because there won't be vetting. It'll be a DIY vetting by the right-wing press, because every 16-year-old now has got a Twitter feed. Every 16-year-old has an Instagram. And when those 16-year-olds are 24 and applying for junior producer jobs, that is where I would expect now, because as you can tell from this conversation, my whole obsession is the arrival of right-wing style plebeian politics from America. There will be people, NGOs created to troll through every BBC member and find out what they said when they were 16. That's the world we're entering. So I think I'm not so worried about the MI5, MI6 server in the basement anymore.
Tom, do you want to come in on any of that? Because I know you had some quite strong thoughts about the vetting.
I don't disagree with the broad picture. I mean, so we know that vetting took place up until the 1980s. In fact, I think it's just that, to me, this is more one piece of a broader relationship between, I guess, the higher echelons of the BBC and the secret state, and that we can't say with any authority what kind of influence that has, but certainly I'm sure we exchange sort of anecdotes about informal relationships and conversations that take place at the top of the BBC. But to me, you just need to put vetting in the context of the BBC sort of orientation towards British officialdom. I do think that is still a problem, and particularly when you get something like defence reporting, the expectation, coming back to what Paul said about anti-imperialism, the expectation there is that a defence reporter at the BBC will be sort of embedded almost within that kind of establishment, and I think that is a problem. Vetting itself, as Paul said, I don't think Paul would have got through the vetting process, and I'm not aware of any evidence that still takes place at the BBC.
Can I just say though, I think that there is I've worked on BBC and Channel 4, and the senior editors of programmes there have to have, and police, reporters, security reporters, crime reporters, they have to have a privileged relationship with the state. I mean, for example, not just about getting stories, but literally getting people in and out of situations, being able to be briefed. There is no active denotice system, but it is informal. And I think that my experience of that is that actually, I don't want to be some kind of apologist for the British state. That aspect of the informal relationship is often worked quite sensitively by the other side. That what we should worry about, I think, above all, is if you can create teams of people who are openly disagreeing and have clear background, sort of backstories that are very different, then you can create a news product that is responsible to the society that it's in. I've worked in teams, well, the BBC, but especially at Channel 4, where you had devout practicing Muslim journalists sitting in the room when we were talking about covering the Arab world and the Middle East. That hasn't always been the case in every team I've worked in. It makes a big difference. So I think it's who is in the room that is what I would come back to as the most important thing about keeping journalism straight and focused on truth.
So just, we're going to have to wrap it all up now, but I just had one final question I wanted to ask to David. You said in our film that the battle to be independent is constant, ongoing, and depends on the characters of the chairman of the BBC, the director general of the BBC, the heads of news. We've just had a new director general. Bearing Tim Davie in mind, I just want to ask you about the upcoming appointment of the chairman. You yourself have been linked to the job. The other names that have been floated are all pretty hostile towards the BBC. So what's at stake here?
Well, I put my name for the job only in order to prevent Charles Moore being given a shoe-in as chairman, which appeared to be what the government was intending. I have no idea whether they were. I just thought, this is crazy. You can't have the newspapers all briefing that Charles Moore, just appointed to the House of Lords, incidentally, is suddenly going also to become the chairman of the biggest news organization, which he has always shown his contempt for over many years. So I thought, I'm going to put a bomb under this one by saying, okay, if he runs, I'll run, and then we'll have a public debate, and I'll challenge him to a public debate. It was as simple as that. I don't know the candidates now, but my suspicion, I don't know the answer to this. The first thing is, when the last time a chairman was appointed deliberately by a prime minister, a conservative prime minister, to emasculate the BBC, was Marmaduke Hussey, who'd been at the Times as boss of the Times, and he, within a few months, sacked Alistair Milne as Director General. Tim Davie has only just come in and only just been appointed by the outgoing, not chairman, but the outgoing body. And I think it would be very hard for him to be removed from post. I think he's been quite feline, and Tom will no doubt disapprove of this, has been quite feline in sending out little tiny messages about fairly minor things to show that he's not totally averse to the idea that there are improvements that can be made to the BBC. But I think he's an independent man. He has his political record is a failed attempt to be a councillor in Hammersmith, I think. So he's an independent-minded man. He's a tough man. He understands the industry, the problems the BBC faces with the competition from Netflix and all the rest. So he's a good man in that way. And I don't think these people who are listed as possible chairman, I can't even remember their names, whoever they are, but I don't think a chairman will come in now and act radically against the new Director General. And from what I know of the new Director General, he won't allow himself to be leant on and pushed around in that way. So I'm quite confident that the battle isn't won against this government, but I think the first skirmish has been won. There's a long way to go, but I think the first skirmish has been won. And whoever's appointed chairman, I don't want them to become, poacher becomes gamekeeper or whatever. I want them to have an independent stance, but I do want them to be somebody who respects all the things all three of us been talking about, the role of the BBC and the importance of it, and the importance of it constantly adapting and changing to fit the modern world and to fit our society and all of that. And I hope that's what will be appointed, not somebody with an agenda to say, smash the BBC. Like with John Burke we were talking about, you try and change the culture. And actually, if you're going to have it at all, the culture isn't going to change. It's not going to become a government mouthpiece. It's not going to be like Italian television where the government chooses, exactly who does what. Berlusconi puts in editors and producers. It's not going to be like that because there's too much of a groundswell of support for the BBC. So I think, it's difficult times, but I think we're in reasonable hands. And I just hope the chairman is sensible enough to see that all the things that Paul has been talking about diversity and things are being addressed and will be addressed.
Thank you, David, and thank you to Paul and to Tom for speaking with us this evening. Thank you all for coming and joining us, and apologies to those of you whose questions we didn't get to. Thank you to the Frontline Club for hosting us. Please check out their website for future events. For any of you who haven't seen the film that we put together, Battle for the BBC, do check it out on YouTube. And you can watch the listening posts for your weekly dose of media analysis. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheers, David. Cheers, Tom.
Cheers. Bye-bye.